are going to tackle solving by square roots because, well, now that we have yesterday, and we might have to flip back a time or two if we need to our chart to help us out. But when we're going to solve by square roots, when we have equations, and again, this is going to be more generic. Actually, very generic. X squared equals n. Well, I mean, n's just a number. Okay? When that occurs, what we can do is we can take the square root of both sides and get to a solution. Now, here's the part about quadratics and square roots that throw people off. It doesn't matter what level I'm teaching it at, the same thing happens. The two things that get people stuck is not taking the square root of both sides. It's steps 1 and 3 up here. Sometimes people forget to get x squared by itself before they do the square root, and it causes all sorts of problems. We'll kind of see that down here. I might even mess one of these up actually purposefully, not an accident like I do some of the times. And then the other one is when you get your solution, there's actually going to be 2 answers for these. So we're going to do a plus minus to help us with that. Because the squared here, that's what that means. It means there's 2 answers to that possible polynomial. So like if there was a 4 sometime, I mean there are 4 answers. But we're not going to get into all that. We're keeping it to square roots for right now. So, job 1. We'll start simple. We'll kind of work our way up here a little bit. So job 1 is to get that x squared by itself. So once we get that job done, that's when we get to go ahead and we get to do the square root. So here's the way I like to try and remember it. Whenever I do the square root step, and again, squared and square root are opposites. That's how we get this down to x. But whenever I do the square root step, I automatically put plus minus down with my x equals before I do anything else, because that way I won't forget. Is 64 a perfect square?
Yes.
Yeah, what's that going to be?
8.
8. There's my 2 answers. I'm good. So, and on a lot of these, it's going to come out nice. Now, we're going to see a few not going to come out so nice, but that's okay. And again, if you can do some of these middle steps without, putting the -8 or something like that, that's okay. I just don't want you going so fast that you make a silly mistake. So 2 opposites this time, but still nothing too stressful at this point. So, felt that one coming. Do our square root, thank you. Always remember my plus minus right away. Again, that one comes out pretty clean, pretty quick. That's what I was looking for. So you're like, all right, Hardy, we got these. Let's throw a twist in and see what happens. We're going to have a little pause here in a moment because we're going to run into a situation. Oh dear. So I'm like, all right, subtract and divide. Now, hang tight here, Mr. H. What the heck is going on here? Okay. So, bless you, a couple things to keep track of. Let me get out of my graph mode. So I'm like, all right, 16 divided by 81. No, that's like all decimally. What the heck? Here's how I want you to look at it instead. When you have a radical, it's a fraction. It is perfectly legal for you to break the numerator and denominator into separate square roots. Because sometimes that'll make it more, oh, wait a minute. 16's a perfect square. And so is 81. We want exact answers on these. We don't want decimals. Now, you may wonder, wait a minute, can I do that in the calculator? And you can. If you do the square root, so the second and the x squared, there's my square root, and do 16 divided by 81, yes, it's going to come out a decimal at first, but if we do math, enter, enter, you can get the actual breakdown all at once if you wanted to. But again, just remember your plus minus there, because the calculator's not going to tell you that part. So you can break it into pieces. We can use the calculator and simplify whatever works. But don't let the fractions get to you. That's not a big deal. All right, let's see what other twists we can run into here. If your basic algebra skills are decent, the first couple of steps of these aren't going to be real rough, hopefully. Okay. So I think about this one for a minute. Is 2 a perfect square?
No.
No. And besides 1, there's nothing else that can go into it's a perfect square because it's too little. So sometimes we're just going to have to leave the radical alone, which is perfectly legal. We always check to make sure we can't break it down further like we were doing yesterday, but sometimes that's just not going to be the case. But sometimes we might be able to, not that I'm giving you a hint on this next one. And again, that temptation is going to be there sometimes. You're like, ooh, if I take the square root now, that's a perfect square, but that 2's in the way. Dang it. So no doing the square root part till that x squared is by itself, even though I like the other one better. So we kind of see our plus minuses are first, our dividing is second. So now, 32, if you need to flip back to your chart from yesterday, we need to find something that's going to go into 32 that we can break this down, but you want the biggest one.
16 and 2.
Nice, you didn't get fooled at all. Because I'll see lots of 4 and 8s on these sometimes, which I can understand. So 16 and 2, but 16 is perfect, so it can break down. 2, not so much. So we've seen so far, it can be a perfect square right off the bat, break down clean. Fractions might be able to break down a little, be okay. And sometimes nothing's going to break down at all. Okay, so we a little bit of everything going on here. I'm trying to see where our last weird things are going to be. 7 and 9. Well, let's start with those. Let's start with 7 and 9. I want to try a couple things that are going to look different here. Okay, first things first. That's still a positive 4. That negative's with my 3x. So we still want to make sure we're doing opposites that same way. Divide by negative 3. We're not adding 3 here because there's no minus in between. Negative divided by negative is positive. So a couple steps. And again, if you weren't here yesterday, you'll want to kind of go back and see. We'll kind of reference that here in a minute. Actually, let me do it now. Some of you are like, wait a minute, Hardy, what are you doing? Why are you flipping? Going back to yesterday for just a second here. So yesterday, and even if you wanted to just borrow my notes to jot down, you could. We talked about all these perfect squares that we were looking at and how we can use them to break down radicals. And so what we're doing with these, when we get numbers that aren't perfect squares, are we're looking for a number in this list that's going to go into our number, divide into our number so we can break it down more. So like here, with what we're doing, we've got 27. So I'd be looking at these numbers that are less than, whoops, kind of helps if I'm on the screen, less than 27 that'll go into it nicely. 9 does. So if I divide 9 into 27, I get 3. Ooh, this is going to be lots of 3's. And get me to my solution. So let's see. Let's do 9, and then we'll kind of decide if we want to do 6 or 8 too here to make sure on things. I just don't want to overkill you here. All right, let's get that alone first. Now, suggestion. When you're trying, I know we're multiplying by -1/2, and in your head you want to divide by -1/2, but that looks confusing, and it is sometimes, and I have people think it's 20, and it's not. I like better if you have a fraction here to multiply by its reciprocal, and I could just write -2. I didn't have to put the 1. But that's going to make more sense, and it also is more than likely going to get me to the right answer. So -40 times -2 would be +80. And I'll give you a forewarning. I am going to be flipping back to my chart here in a second, because I want to stress one more thing. I know we did yesterday, but I want to do it one more time. Yesterday when we were talking, you've got to make sure that you get the greatest perfect square out. So when you're looking at all these numbers that could go into 80, you might look at this and say, well, 4 can. I'm just going to use that. But is that the biggest one? I don't think it is. So as you're trying to divide some of these other ones into 80, I think you're going to find one bigger one that's going to go in. What bigger square? 16 is going to go in. And even if you weren't sure, you're like, how am I supposed to know if these things? Just try dividing them on your calculator. If you tried some of the bigger ones, and it's like, okay, decimals aren't working, but yeah, 16 worked. So 16 is perfect, so that one is going to get out. And I've got my answer. So again, all types of answers that we're looking at with these when we're working with them. And so what I'm going to have you do, which is going to prep us good for tomorrow. Again, this is nice the way these work, is, and I'll put this one back up in a sec. In the practice on 4 and 5p, you've got a nice little selection of all the things here. So we're going to kind of work on 4 and 5 here. And